here. It's a pleasure to have Professor Keyssar today with us for this special live session of the INCT-INEU, Instituto Nacional de Estudos sobre Estados Unidos. We are very honored to host Professor Alex Keyssar, Stilling Professor of History and Social Policy at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Professor Keyssar is one of the most respected historians of American democracy, known internationally for his groundbreaking work on voting rights, political institutions, and the evolution of democratic systems in the United States. Professor Keyssar will be speaking on a crucial topic entitled University Autonomy, Academic Freedom, and Politics in the U.S. He will bring us some historic insights, okay? And before we begin, I just want to say how timely and relevant this discussion is for us, not only for understand this culture in US, but also for thinking about broader global challenges to academic freedom and democratic life. And I'd like to make just a brief note. Professor Keyssar will speak in English, but he is kindly open to receiving questions in Portuguese. So please feel free to write your question in the chat or send us a message, okay? Bom, pessoal, boa tarde, obrigado por todos aqui, né, estarem aqui na nossa audiência. É um prazer muito grande ter o professor Keyssar aqui conosco hoje. Ele vai falar em inglês, se ele prefere, vai ficar mais à vontade, desenvolve mais aqui as ideias, a troca de ideias, mas ele gentilmente se ofereceu para ler as perguntas, ou seja, a gente pode passar essas perguntas na tela, e então vocês podem fazer as perguntas em português, tá? And before handing it over to Professor Keyssar, I'd like to first invite two colleagues who have played key roles in the history of our institute. First, I will hand it over to Professor Andrei Koerner, da Unicamp, the current coordinator of the INCT-INEU. Then we will hear from Professor Sebastião Velasco, who served as coordinator from 2017 and 2025, and was central to the development of the Institute. They will offer a few welcome remarks before we begin today's talk. The word would be to Professor Keyssar again. So, Professor Andrei, over to you. Thank you.
Bom, boa tarde a todas e todos. Eu agradeço pela sua abertura. Eu gostaria de apresentar meus sinceros agradecimentos ao professor Keyssar por ter aceitado fazer essa conferência para nós sobre a situação do governo dos Estados Unidos e as universidades. Então, aqui eu agradeço muito. Esta é mais uma atividade, né, do início da terceira fase do INCT-INEU. Nós teremos seminários ou conferências mensais nesse mesmo horário. Nós já tivemos dois eventos, e esse é o terceiro, e estamos programando eventos para os próximos meses. Nosso objetivo é trazer pessoas que façam análises e, ao mesmo tempo, relatos sobre a preocupante, né, situação do que está acontecendo nos Estados Unidos nesses meses e nesse início do segundo governo Trump. Então, com muita, ao mesmo tempo, alegria e preocupação que inicio este seminário, e agradecendo novamente ao professor Keyssar e passando a palavra para a Neuza para continuar a condução dessa sessão.
Obrigada, professor Andrei. Agora eu gostaria de passar a palavra para o professor Sebastião. e em seguida nós voltamos com o professor Keyssar.
Bom, boa tarde a todos e a todas. Eu queria acrescentar aqui 2 ou 3 palavras para falar não da alegria de estar de novo com o professor Keyssar, mas dizer da longa relação que nós temos. Nós, eu digo, o professor Alex Keyssar e o INEU, o Instituto Nacional de... Nós nos conhecemos lá atrás, pouco depois de aprovado e implantado o INEU, em 2009, e em 2010, nós tivemos, acho que já ainda em 2009, o primeiro contato com o professor, que já no ano seguinte estava conosco aqui em São Paulo, oferecendo um curso sobre instituições, processos políticos nos Estados Unidos. O engajamento dele, o entusiasmo com a nossa iniciativa e o engajamento prático se deu inicialmente dessa forma de um curso que dividiu com colegas, enfim, que estávamos naquela época fazendo um esforço mais sistemático de entender a realidade que ele conhecia tão bem. Nessa ocasião, em agosto de 2010, o professor Keyssar deu uma conferência memorável aqui para nós, organizados pelo INEU, na PUC de São Paulo, com o título The Balanced Act of Barack Obama, o equilíbrio delicado de Barack Obama. 2010, o mundo era outro, o mundo nos Estados Unidos era outro, estavam saindo de uma crise econômica e financeira sem precedentes desde a crise de 29, e comandados por um político absolutamente improvável, que se distinguia pela sua etnia e pelo seu brilho, que nos entusiasmou a todos aqui no Brasil. Que estávamos vivendo também um momento muito especial, tínhamos passado muito bem pela crise de 2008, e em 2010 o presidente Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva terminava o seu mandato com 80% de aprovação, segundo todas as pesquisas. Hoje nós estamos vivendo uma situação completamente diferente. O professor Keyssar, professor de Harvard, está com a sua instituição sob ataque, e nós, no Brasil, estamos sob ataque. Estávamos juntos lá atrás, em 2010, estamos juntos agora, em 2025. Não sei, há provavelmente outras definições melhores, mas estar juntos, nos bons e nos maus momentos, pode ter uma definição de amizade. Eu passo a palavra, I give the floor to our friend Alex Keyssar. Thank you.
Muito obrigado to everyone for inviting me, and Professor Sebastião for the very generous introduction. It's a pleasure for me to be back in São Paulo, even if remotely. And let me begin by apologizing for speaking in English and not in Portuguese, but my Portuguese was never very good, and it is now quite rusty. But as Nois have mentioned, I will take questions in Portuguese if you ask them devagar. In any case, it is a great pleasure for me to be here, although it is an unhappy reason. It is an unhappy occasion. The subject that I'll be speaking about today, and that brings us together, is a very serious and frightening one. The autonomy of universities in the United States is indeed under threat, very serious threat. It has already been compromised in some places, and it is not evident to me, at least, how this story will end. The terrain shifts with each passing week for this spectrum of higher education in the United States. And speaking more parochially in terms of what will happen here at my own institution at Harvard, which, as some of you may know, has been a particular target of the Trump administration. Let me begin. I thought what I could most usefully do is to provide a bit of context to what is going on, and then make my comments, and then open this up to your questions. So let me begin with simply a reference, and some of you may know this, others may not, to the importance of the segmentation of the American higher education system. It is not, we do not have a unified national higher education system in the United States. Higher education consists partly of public institutions funded by states, not the federal government, but by states, and partly private institutions. Both exist. The private institutions are older, dating back to the 17th and 18th centuries. They are generally more prestigious, but not always. They also include colleges, which are just for undergraduates, not for people doing graduate degrees. And some of these are sort of very well endowed small colleges. And then, of course, there are the universities with major graduate programs and professional programs. The public universities are the creation of the late 19th century and of the 20th century, particularly the immediate post-World War II period. The very big expansion post-World War II, and then even into the 1970s. These are universities with research arms and graduate programs, as well as undergraduate programs. The funding of public universities has traditionally been by state legislatures, although in recent decades, that funding has gotten more scarce, and in some places, the funding for public universities has become largely or predominantly private. The University of California in Los Angeles, for example, and the University of California at Berkeley receive funds from the state government, but they receive even more funds from private endowments and gifts. The private universities, including the one where I teach, are funded by significant endowments that have built up over the years, and by substantial tuition. It's very expensive to go to a private university or college in the United States, although financial aid is quite widely available. To give an example here is that at Harvard, if you are a student admitted as an undergraduate at Harvard, you do not pay any tuition if your family makes less than $200,000 a year. I think that's more than $1 million reais with the current exchange rates. Now, all of these different kinds of institutions are part of the extensive research world that was created in the wake of World War II. World War II is a threshold in the history of American higher education, both because we come out as the dominant power, but also a need, looking at adversaries and friends, a perceived need for the United States to become a center for advancing science and social science. And there was an implicit policy decision that was made in Washington by the federal government that the United States would not create large-scale federal government research centers. That would not be the role of the federal government. For example, I know in France, a country that I know well, there are very significant nationally funded government centers for research. The United States did not adopt that route. Instead, the government decided that it would fund research through the universities. It created institutions or agencies that would receive money from the federal government and that would be in charge of dispersing those funds to universities, to autonomous institutions, both public and private. And you see this in a number of different areas, in health, medicine, pure science, certainly the defense industry, or defense industries and defense research was farmed out. The creation of the National Science Foundation, or much more modestly, the National Endowment for the Humanities. There were also, in the States, there were somewhat different models. And the models are not exclusive, but the models which are to build their own universities within different states that would have perhaps general areas of excellence, but would also have research capacities and research foci, research centers, clusters of interest that would respond to local, meaning statewide issues or needs of business. Thus, for example, there are state universities in the Midwest that have significant departments that basically deal with the science of agriculture and with increasing agricultural productivity. This is a model, this broad model of the federal government not being involved but providing funds, is one that has worked well. It has sometimes bent or distorted the interests of institutions, of private or public universities. For example, MIT, the institution that is just down the road from where I am right now, MIT found itself at times, I think, a little bit distorted, a little bending in the direction of doing a great deal of research for the Pentagon and defense industries. There have always been, or long been, some restrictions imposed on these universities. For example, and this is relevant to the current crisis, there are civil rights laws. It was coming out of the civil rights laws of the 1960s, were various laws that, in effect said that the universities could not discriminate against people because of their race, religion, or pretty much anything else. And there are a lot of procedural regulations, so that the federal government has been present, but not, in the whole, has not. The federal government has been present, and it is in a position. It has long been in a structural position to wield tremendous power over universities, but that power has rarely been exercised in significant ways. There has been a tacit and bipartisan understanding that within some limits, and there are limits, but within some limits, the autonomy of universities should be respected. Now, I also want to note, and I think this is relevant both as historical backdrop, but also as a historical contrast, that there is one earlier period in our history, in U.S. history, when Washington made significant interventions in the universities across the country, including the one where I sit right now. And that was in the 1950s, the period known as the McCarthy period, when many segments of American political life were consumed with anti-communism and fear of communism. And at that time, the federal government, and interestingly, it was Congress more than the president. It was not the Truman or Eisenhower administration so much as members of Congress. And they put significant pressure on universities to fire or not hire professors who were or had been members of the Communist Party, or had belonged to organizations that were linked to the Communist Party, or were too friendly with people who were in such organizations, or who wrote things seen as being too radical or too overtly Marxist. This was true, actually, this was true not only in universities, this kind of ideological pressure, but it actually also affected secondary schools. For example, in New York City, sort of school teachers were purged because of their political beliefs or their association in one way or another with either the Communist Party or any left-wing organization. This 1950s intervention attack had an impact, and people lost their jobs. People had to move from one university to another. Some people were driven out of academic life altogether, never to return. Some subjects became unsafe for anyone to study. We can give you a personal anecdote. I began my scholarly career as a labor historian, as a historian of labor. And there were many people in my generation who did that. I began graduate school in the early 1970s. And I remember, and the field was blossoming in the early 1970s. And there was the first big conference on labor history that had been convened was in about 1975, 1976, convened at Rutgers. And it was remarkable when one looked around the room at what the demographic composition was of people who were interested in labor history. It was all people who were under 30 or over 55. There was a missing generation or two of people who did not study labor because the subject was potentially too controversial and they would not be employable. And then, of course, I mean, another example of that was that there was no hint in U.S. economics departments, with a few exceptions, there was no hint of Marxist economics or analysis. But what happened in the 1950s differed in two key and I think revealing ways from what is happening now. The first is that the precipitant, the source of the attacks came from a perceived foreign threat in the Cold War and the fear of subversion. Now, I mean, with modern scholarship and with some perspective, we can certainly see that was something between misplaced and misguided, and maybe altogether erroneous. But the country had just come out of one war, and there was a sense of external threat, which then became translated into a sense of, or spread, filtered into a sense of internal threat. And that is very different from anything that is going on today. Although, that said, there are occasional gestures in that direction. I know my own school here at Harvard has been accused of having connections to the Chinese Communist Party because somebody 10 years ago organized a conference in China on health policy. But in general, that's not what's going on now. The second notable difference is that the targets of federal government suppression in the 1950s were individual faculty members and not the institutions themselves. And the idea, the thrust of it was to purge the universities of those individuals and those who had similar beliefs. And it was that in turn, and I can go into this more, I don't want to spend too much time in this, but those experiences shaped the whole nature of debates about academic freedom in the United States. In particular, the question was, there were two linked questions. One was the relationship between a person's private beliefs and even private actions as a citizen and what they did in the classroom. And then the other question, which was more insidious, at the time was whether someone who belonged to a communist party or any such organization could have the sufficient freedom of thought to be a responsible faculty member. But there were debates about academic freedom, and they were resolved largely in the direction of tolerance, not complete tolerance, not by any means, but they were resolved largely in the direction of certainly not having ideological tests for faculty members, except for those which are, and I'll make some allusion to this, which are implicit and which pervade the society. So now let me turn to what's happening today. What's happening in the U.S. in recent months. And what we are seeing now are attacks by the federal government and by state governments. The federal government is taking the lead, but state governments have been doing this, and very conservative state governments. Marco Rubio in Florida, and Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, have been taking action there for quite a while. But these are attacks on the institutions themselves and on the educational policies that they've adopted. And it's an insistence, what's going on now is an insistence that the programs, policies, admissions policies, and faculty hiring policies, and even the curricula of universities should conform to policies and values articulated by the federal government in Washington. It is an assault on the independence and autonomy of the university. It's not on individual faculty members, at least not yet, but on the autonomy of the universities. And the method of these attacks is in one way or another to deprive, I mean, there's some instances there are lawsuits, but that is generally not what is happening. And the method of these attacks is to withhold research funding from institutions that have policies or programs that the Trump administration objects to, even if that research has absolutely nothing to do with the policies that are being objected to. I mean, one of the standard things is, well, if Columbia University or Harvard has more than a tolerable amount of anti-Semitism, and I will say more about that in a minute. Why should you cancel research, that is in molecular biology that is looking for a cure for cancer? But the point is, they are denying the research grants. They are attempting to deny our ability to teach international students by withholding visas from students who want to come to study at particular universities. And they are planning to dramatically increase the tax on the endowments of the university. I mean, to say that there's a widely discussed figure that Harvard has $53 or $54 billion in endowments, and that's more money than I know how to imagine. But it doesn't have that money to spend. It can spend a large portion of the income from that, and that income was never taxed by the federal government, or the appreciation was not taxed until the first Trump administration, and it's been taxed at a rate of, I think, 1.2%. They're now talking about increasing the tax to 8 or 10%, which would be, for example, in my own institution, hundreds of millions of dollars, which would not be available for educational programs. I want to say one more word here about the nature of the attacks. Is that some of these attacks have happened through the legal system of the government filing suit against institutions to try to compel different behavior. But many of them have simply been administrative moves without filing suit. And some of the institutions, again, most notably Harvard, have filed suits, have gone to court to protest and object to what the Trump administration has been doing, and we are largely winning. I say we. I shouldn't. Well, maybe it's fine. The universities are winning those lawsuits by and large, but they're extremely expensive, and they will go. And the lawsuits themselves will go on for years. But in any case, the basic thrust of this, of what they are doing, is something that that you in Brazil will certainly recognize. I mean, it's the Trump method. He is unhappy about what your court system is doing with former President Bolsonaro, and thus he's going to put a tariff on coffee. Or, I mean, the things have very little relation to each other. In the most common term used for it here is it's an extortion racket. It's a little meaning the resemblance is to what the mafia would do. Basically, would go to storekeepers or to anyone and say, you have to pay us, pay us a certain amount of money or we'll burn down your store. And that's really what is going on. In most cases, the alleged grounds for these attacks are twofold. One, and at the center of it, is the presence of programs that deal with the initials in the United States are DEI, DAE, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. The core of these programs, as they have emerged over the last 30 to 40 years in the United States, was to give some weight or preference to racial and ethnicity factors in admitting students, in hiring faculty, and in hiring staff. And also having to do with the curriculum, what was being taught, and including the teaching of the history and current reality of racial discrimination and racial inequality, and in the past of racial suppression in the United States. Such courses are, they would appear, as I'm sure they do in Brazil too. I mean, the histories of slavery, histories of race after slavery. And in terms of admissions and some faculty hiring, there were what were called affirmative action policies, taking affirmative actions to increase the number of minorities represented as particularly as students, but also as faculty members. These affirmative action programs grow out of the 1960s and 1970s. They extend to Latinos and other minorities. And one starts to see a reaction against this in terms of student admissions. In the late 1970s, there's an important Supreme Court case involving the University of California Medical School, which fudged the issue. It said that race could be considered for admissions, but that there could not be racial quotas for admission. And this became the affirmative action, where there'd be some additional weight and advantage given to minority applicants. Since that time, and such programs were in place just about everywhere. Since that time, there has been a slowly and now rapidly rising opposition to any programs that give preferences to minority applicants for admissions as students or as faculty. And especially during the last decade, sharp and severe criticism of any dimensions of the curriculum, of the actual teaching, that have to do with race and religion in ways that might seem unflattering about the United States. There's an objection to non-celebratory or non-patriotic teachings. The phrase in the United States is that it is being anti-woke. Woke meaning people who are awake to various forms of oppression and discrimination and consider those. It's the anti-woke has been the new movement. These first showed up in terms of curriculum in the state and public universities of conservative states, or states with conservative state governments. The most notable example, again, is Florida. A little less than 2 years ago, I was giving a lecture at one of the campuses of the University of Florida. I think it was Florida International University or Florida Atlantic. And I had a lunch with some of the younger teachers of history, including the graduate students who were teaching assistants. And a law had just been passed in Florida, severely restricting what could be said about race or slavery in the history of Florida. And these young teachers simply were seeking guidance, but they had no idea what they could say in the classroom that was legal or illegal. And that was it was extraordinary for me to hear this conversation and to see these people struggling, and it spread throughout Florida. Another interesting thing of what happened in Florida was that the Florida university system or educational system had created a remarkable small college called New College within the Florida system, and it was a replica of a liberal arts college of the sort that existed in New England and the northern states. Yet it was a state school, and it transformed itself. It became a quite liberal and progressive institution with some notable alumni. And then I think it was about 2 years ago, the state of Florida just simply shut it down, fired all the trustees, got rid of half the faculty, and turned it into a bastion of conservative thought. The second line of attack beyond wokeness and DEI has to do with the alleged presence of anti-Semitism on American campuses. There are very widely publicized charges of anti-Semitism, complaints that became acute during protests over the war in Gaza. There's been rhetoric in those protests that was certainly anti-Israel, the policy of Israel, in which sometimes articulated stances that the state of Israel should not exist. That idea, you can talk about this, but in some circles, the notion that the state of Israel should not exist has become equated with anti-Semitism, which is, to my mind, at least, a very debatable equation. There have also been charges of social anti-Semitism in the treatment of Jewish students, or especially very visible students, for example, who wear yarmulkes, on many campuses, including my own. And these complaints or these discriminations are seen as civil rights violations that violate U.S. civil rights laws. I do not, for a minute, want to say that anti-Semitism does not exist in the United States or on campuses. It does, but the raising of this issue of anti-Semitism in the context of universities is, to my mind, very much pretextual. The issue that it's not the issue. The reality is not anything like what has been portrayed. The presidents of Harvard and MIT, by the way, are both Jewish. I had a conversation about a year ago with a former student of mine who he had been an undergraduate, and then he studied with me for a while, and then he was at Harvard Law School. And he is Jewish. He's from the Boston area, from a Jewish family. And I said to him, I said, look, are you, when all this was coming to the fore, I said, are you worried about anti-Semitism on campus? And he said, no, I'm not at all worried, but my grandmother is, because his grandmother was reading the newspapers. And So, my view is that the anti-Semitism issue really is pretextual. So what is really going on here? And what's really going on, and much as you would think, is that the universities are perceived as centers of leftish thought. And I'm deliberately saying leftish, ISH, leftish, not leftist, because they aren't so much centers of leftist thought, but the political spectrum of most major universities revolves somewhere around somewhere around the center left. Maybe the analog in Brazil would be Fernando Henrique. But the universities are seen as bastions of this leftist thought. There's some truth to this charge. And there are the claims that are made by the government that they want to have more ideological diversity in the universities, but what they really want to establish is their own ideological hegemony. And more broadly, I think they want to purge progressive thought and ideas from American education and discourse. They're also attacking the media. And some of the law firms that have defended progressive positions. They very much want to control the narrative of U.S. history. And there's an element here also in what they are doing that is profoundly anti-science and anti-research and anti-truth. There is an unfamiliarity, an antagonism to science and to the entire enterprise of scholarly research, and a hostility to it that is linked to the ideology of the Trump administration, but has its own separate thrusts. You see a related version of this, of course, in the recent last week firing of the head of the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics because President Trump did not like the numbers they came out with that week. So a lot of this is ideological thrust. And then there's also a kind of anti-elite component to these attacks. It's not a coincidence that they are going mostly after prestigious institutions that are perceived as representing old wealth in the United States. The targets selected are Harvard, Brown, University of Pennsylvania, and Princeton. Although Yale has notably not been subject to much attack, but you see this also in public universities. The president of the University of Virginia, State University, was forced to resign in recent weeks, and actually one other campus in Virginia by a board. I mean, most state universities are ultimately governed by boards that are appointed largely by the governor or other political leaders. And the president of the University of Virginia was reluctant to obey the instructions of the board that they eliminate every aspect of affirmative action or diversity program, and he simply resigned. And that has happened elsewhere as well. In their ultimate goal, there was a document that they sent to Harvard, which sent Harvard into real attack mode, which revealed, I think, their real intentions. What they said that they wanted was to have the government have a role in admissions decisions, in the curriculum, and in faculty appointments. And I think that really is their goal, and that's the end of the autonomy of the universities and the end of academic freedom. So let me round this up with a few final comments. One is that the impact of this so far has been mixed. diversity and affirmative action programs have effectively been relabeled or disbanded and generally weakened. And that is pretty widespread, and I suspect that that will endure, although there is a significant amount of relabeling going on. Don't call it diversity, call it something else, but do the same thing. But those programs are being weakened. And in some instances, the structural autonomy of universities has been undercut or jeopardized. That's certainly true in the public universities in Republican states. They've always been under the supervision of boards, but now those boards have become more active and more ideological, and they are not tolerating behavior by university administrations that do not conform with their political values. And you see it that one of the most clear-cut cases of structural autonomy being jeopardized is in the recent agreement that was reached between Columbia University and the federal government, because they made a deal. I think Columbia is paying $200 million, and in return they get $1 billion in research funds. But they agreed to the existence of a permanent or durable monitor from the government to judge what Columbia is doing and to make sure that it conforms. And that is also something that they have tried to impose on Harvard and on other places. And I think that once that is accepted, then the ball game is over, and Washington is running the universities. Beyond these structural and programmatic changes, I think the other impact that it has had is that there's a lot of self-monitoring going on. There's a certain amount of institutional self-censorship, reluctance to speak out on certain kinds of issues, reluctance to promote certain kinds of programs or issues within the university. To my knowledge, and it says it is not leading to significant self-censorship among individual faculty. I mean, it would be hard to see, but I do not see that happening. And I do not see most institutions turning against individual faculty members, but the institutional programs are threatened. Now, as I said earlier, I don't know how this is going to end. Some institutions have paid a kind of tribute to the king by forking over money. Brown University just did an interesting deal where they, instead of giving money to the federal government, they committed money to some programs that actually the state of Rhode Island, where Brown is, would benefit from. And others may follow that model. It seems more palatable than buying Trump coins, which probably would be the administration's first choice. I think that in most places the universities and university leaders are wishing that they can muddle through the next couple of years, and that this will be over and that we can return to business as usual, that somehow we can just sort of make our way through the next few years. They hope that the Democrats will win in 2026 and that Trump will be gone. That may well be wishful thinking, but that is, I think, what is in the minds of a lot of administrators. The implications of this for democracy, for American democracy, are profound, as is true for many other dimensions of Trumpian policies and Trumpian actions. I mean, this isn't unique. What is going on in the universities is part and parcel of a much broader assault on freedom of thought and on democracy in the United States. Universities always reflect the values of their societies, and one can never claim that American universities have welcomed all beliefs or all types of inquiry. But the range of what has been acceptable in the modern American universities since World War II, the range has generally been broad, in part because of our values, and in part because of the decentralization of our higher education system. The fact that there is no place that really controls a lot of it. I mean, it's true even in state universities. The one branch of the University of Massachusetts became a center for an open center for the study of Marxist economics in the 1970s. The universities are always instruments of the same social forces that determine state power, but they exist with a special mandate, which is, and it's corny, but it's true, to seek truth and to engage in the kind of open inquiry and debate that can advance science and can advance social goals. That's our reason for being. And if the mandate for doing that weakens, as it has, and weakens further, I think that the resistance to the accelerating authoritarianism that is appearing in the United States will be profoundly weakened, and that will be one additional step in the erosion of democracy in the United States. Thank you. Thanks for listening. Sorry I went on so long. But there was a lot to say.
Thank you very much, Professor Keyssar. Thank you for this insightful and thought-provoking presentation. I think you have touched on deeply important questions that resonate well beyond the U.S. context. And I'm sure many in our audience are interested to engage further with your ideas. Well, now we can open the session for questions and comments from the audience. Pessoal, fique à vontade para escrever as perguntas no chat, como eu falei no início, né, em português ou em inglês. O professor vai ser, né, se ofereceu para se esforçar aqui em entender a pergunta e responder né, para vocês. Então,
I see one question in front of me. Should I answer that first? I see a written question in front of me from Laura about whether in today's tech rivalry, these politics of interference in universities pose a risk of losing the country's advantage in attracting top researchers. I think the answer is yes, it would. Yes, it does. I mean, I think that, I think that the United States has benefited historically by being a place that a lot of top researchers in many different fields have come to when they could not function in their own countries. And that process can certainly be reversed. And now I also would expect that there are figures on the far right, especially in the tech world, who might try to create their own institutions in order to try to maintain that tech advantage. But I certainly think that that what is going on will in universities, poses a real risk. I think that there are broad analogies to Trump's policies that the short-term gains he might be seeking also contain substantial risks of long-run losses. That seems to be true in the tariff policies also. I'm seeing another one. Okay, this. The question is, I'm getting it in English. Do you think this rivalry with China reinforces the use of communism as a scare tactic in universities, which is a long-standing strategy? I haven't seen much of that. The rivalry with China is real. It's a little bit incoherent, but it's real. And occasionally this specter of communist, links to communism and communist, comes up. but I haven't. I. I mean, there are two dimensions to this, or several dimensions to this. One is it's not clear to me, I think, or to a lot of other people, what there is that is still communist about China, and to the extent that China is represents a form of dictatorship, the current regime doesn't seem to be particularly opposed to that. But I don't see a new Red Scare, a new anti-communist thrust coming. But I could be wrong about that. Quite the question. I don't know. I don't know whether everybody can see the questions or not. So I'm reading them out. How do you assess the retreat of some universities and media outlets in the face of pressure from Trump? Doesn't giving in to him reinforces control? I mean, I do think that giving in to him reinforces his control. I think that what the temptation has been for a lot of institutions has been, well, we will make a gesture. You know, we will not run, the media outlets will not run a certain kind of program, or they will demote somebody. But there's I think the historical patterns are that giving in to someone like Trump about a certain thing, giving him something doesn't mean he's not going to come back for more. So I think that, you know, and I think, for example, and again, if forgive me if I'm too parochial, but I think that there was a real sense of when Harvard, in effect, last spring, stood up to the government and said no and refused its demands. There was a real sense of pride and a real sense that this, you know, that this would, that this was the right strategy. Now, that said, okay, I'm not going to be at all surprised if Harvard, like other places, works out some kind of deal to save the research programs of half of the medical school and the School of Public Health. It's a good question about the conflicts between students at universities, and particularly after Supreme Court decisions. I'm not aware of conflicts between students being worsened by this, but I'm also not in a position. I don't think I have a good firsthand acquaintance. I don't teach undergraduates. I only teach graduate students, and I'm a little outside of the normal, a little removed from student life, aside from what I read in the student newspapers. So I don't know the answer to that. A question about the role played by digital technologies and big tech companies in this process. Well, you know, it's certainly true that big tech companies certainly seem more interested in their own advancement and their own success than they are in academic freedom or the autonomy of universities. That certainly seems absolutely true. And they're not doing anything to impede. I mean, there is a right wing in Silicon Valley, and it's cheering things on. That said, I don't see, or I haven't seen them playing a major role in what's going on in this process within the universities. Let me leave it at that.
Oh, Professor. Well, I don't know if I have got right everything you said, but do you think that what is qualitatively new is the combination of politicized policymaking, such as banning the DEI, as you mentioned, programs, DEI programs, restricting tenure or cutting funds, with a populist digital campaign that seeks to delegitimize higher education as a whole. I mean, we see these attacks as part of a long-standing suspicion of intellectual elites in different cultures, including American culture. However, what has changed is the intensity, scale, and level of coordination, especially with the rise of authoritarian populism globally, but in US as an example.
I think that what one is seeing here, I mean, I think that the forces that are attacking the university represent a coalition of different groups and interests. For example, in the attack on DEI, this is partly the sort of middle class and upper middle class white people wanting to be sure that their own students can get into the top universities, that their own children can get into the top universities. And then there is an anti-elite populist thrust, I think, which is very much there. I mean, I think that it's there is a way in which the MAGA right in the United States includes large numbers of people who feel that that the elites have manipulated things to disadvantage them and give advantages to Black people and Hispanics and immigrants. And they are hostile to those elites and to the institutions that they represent. And I think that pervades. I think that pervades what's going on. But I think that there is also, the Trump world also includes a lot of people from the elites who I think are trying to protect their own privileges and their own advantages.
Right.
Is it possible to measure or predict? It's a very good question. I'm sure it is possible to measure it, but I think it will take some time. I think we're at the very early stages of this. We don't know what it's. I know that there are a variety of stories, of anecdotes about people leaving the U.S. and going elsewhere, and I know that those are true, but I don't know how large it is. And with the certainly there's some evidence already that legal changes against affirmative action or against giving advantage have led to a decline in the enrollment of minority students at major universities. But I think we're at an early stage yet. I'm reading that. Whoops, I skipped one. What can stop Trump if not the Congress and the SCOTUS? Well, right now, neither Congress nor SCOTUS is making much of an effort. Look, I think, and this goes back to my own areas of scholarly expertise, I think that the only thing that can stop Trump would be elections that not only defeat him and his party but repudiate them. And I am deeply concerned. It's a whole other subject, but it's a subject about which I actually do know something. But I am deeply concerned that we are not going to have free and fair elections in 2026 or 2028. Can I ask a question to the organizers here before I go on? Hold on. how much time do we have? I'm happy to stay and answer more questions for a while, but I'd like to take a 2-minute break if I could.
Okay, it's okay.
Can I take a 2-minute break and come back?
Yeah, that's good. Okay.
Okay, I'll be right back.
Okay. Que bom, a gente está tendo bastante perguntas, né? E eu vou até perguntar para ele se bom, ele falou que tem o tempo suficiente, então ele só precisaria fazer o break, né? Mas de qualquer forma, a gente talvez tenha que parar aqui em algum tempo, né, Sebastião? Quer colocar um tempo para a gente encerrar?
Tempo, mas eu acho bom. Estamos aqui a 1h08, mais ou menos, 1h10. Acho que podia ter 1h30, enfim, até
No máximo, né?
5h30, né? O que o Andrei acha, o que o Zé acha? André saiu também. Não,
sim, eu acho que é esse é o teto, né?
5h30, né? Vou pegar uma água para mim.
Pessoal, vou aproveitar para quem está nos assistindo, não esquecer de seguir o canal do INEU, curtir o nosso vídeo, acompanhar todas as nossas transmissões, nossas publicações e muito material interessante aqui no nosso canal. Fica aí o convite para todos vocês.
Obrigada, Bela, isso mesmo, ainda bem que você lembrou. Isso é sempre bom, né? E deixa um comentário para a gente, né, na tela.
Pessoal, vou dar outro recado aqui também, aproveitando. Nós, do INEU, vamos fazer um segundo evento dessa semana, amanhã, no programa Santiago Dantas, e vai ser transmitido pelo canal do Grupo de Estudos sobre Conflitos Internacionais, youtube.com/gsbook. É uma conferência sobre ONU, Hiroshima e Nagasaki e a Ordem Liberal Internacional, Realidade ou Mito, com os professores Andrei Koerner, Reginaldo Nasser e o Marco Sepic. Então, também fica um outro convite para vocês.
I'm back.
Oh, great. I have a question, but before I'd like to say that we are going to finish 5:30, okay? So just
Sure.
for your proclamation, and I hope that you have no problem with this time, okay?
No, that's fine.
That's okay. So my question is, looking ahead, how do you assess the long-term impact of Trump administration's actions on the government, on the governance and public perception of universities in the United States and perhaps globally? Do you believe that the erosion of academic freedom and institutional autonomy has already been normalized to some extent, particularly at the state level, and what risk does this pose for a higher education, increasingly polarized political environment? So yeah, I don't know if I make clear for you, but if you.
If I'm understanding what you're saying, I mean, I think that we don't know yet what the durable, impact is going to be on the structures and behaviors. I mean, I think that if the Republicans remain in power through 2028 and beyond, then I think that the university system, the educational system, and university that we've known in the United States for the last half century or more, I think that these institutions can resist for a while, but they can't resist. They will not be able to resist forever. They will make compromises, and the compromises will not produce catastrophic results immediately, but they will produce a gradual erosion, and I don't know what the long-term effects of that will be, but it will certainly mean that the American universities will be weaker and less attractive to people and less vibrant, and that there will be less reason for people to become university professors or researchers, and students will receive a much more formulaic kind of education. But that's, again, there's the big if here. I mean, I guess perhaps what I'm saying at bottom is that how this story. I think there's already been a significant impact, and a significant damage. But if, for example, a lot of universities were to band together and really take a strong stance and reject any intrusions into their autonomy, and continue to fight in the courts, even at significant cost. Forgive me while I take a little sip of a Coca-Cola. I am American after all. But even that, if that happens, then it's not inconceivable that the autonomy of universities will be increased. I mean, there's a potentially positive scenario that there will be a reaction against this, that will lead to a strengthening of the autonomy and of academic freedom. But it really is all going to depend what happens in politics and to who is in power. Yes, I think that the far right. I'm reading a question that the far right's negative portrayal of universities and the hype around stuff like woke has made it easier for Congress to back. Yes, absolutely. I think that they've created that the far right, and not just the right in general, has created a caricature of what life is like in the in these universities, and that does make it easier for Congress to back interference. I mean, the anecdote that I told about the student of mine who said, the Jewish student of mine who said he wasn't worried about anti-Semitism, but his grandmother was. She's picking up stuff from the media, which is coming in fact from these sources of people who have never set foot on the campus. And then when people hear these caricatures, people in Congress hear these caricatures, and they're told that there's a problem, and they go along with it. They make it much easier to take action or to tolerate actions that they might otherwise think about. Let me just add one. If Trump does not finish his term, would J.D. Vance be worse for academic freedom and education in the U.S. I suspect that Vance would be worse, although he has some pretenses himself to a kind of intellectual credibility, and that could make him much more dangerous, or it could lead him perhaps to back off. But it's yeah, I it's a good question. Would he be worse? I hope we don't get to find out whether J.D. Vance would be worse or not.
Well, we have more questions on the chat.
Are you asking me or telling me?
Yeah, I'm talking to Isabella. Isabella is reading out there. I think that there's no question anymore, all right? Well, so okay. I believe we don't have any more questions from the audience, so we can now move towards the closing of our session. Once again, I would like to thank you, Professor Keyssar. Thank you so much for your generosity in sharing your time. I know if you are a busy man, so these reflections with us and for engaging so with boa vontade e atenção, né, and attention with the questions from our audience. So this conversation reminds us of how essential academic freedom and institutional autonomy are for democratic life, and why it is so important to defend them, especially in times of political pressure and uncertainty. So, yeah.
Oh, I was going to thank all of you. I mean, I don't have any idea how many people was in the audience or who you are, but the questions have been excellent, and I just want to thank you all for spending part of your afternoon or early evening talking about this very serious subject. And I hope I was able to offer something that might be helpful.
Oh, sure. We hope this is just the beginning of further exchange between Professor Keyssar and our academic community here in Brazil, because we, as Sebastião Velasco told, we know Professor Keyssar since 2010, and in this new phase of the INCT, we hope that we can have another opportunities then to exchange these and receive you here in Brazil. We are good. We'll be happy with this. And I'd like to thank you on behalf of the INCT-INEU. I'd like to thank you, all of you who joined us today, professors, students, and members of the public, for your participation and interest. Thank you so much for joining us. Agradeço muito todo mundo que esteve aqui com a gente, né? Investiu esse tempo para ouvir aqui os insights, as reflexões aqui do professor Keyssar. Então, a gente é muito grato a vocês. Eu estou falando aqui em nome de todos os meus colegas e os coordenadores principais, os pesquisadores principais do INCT. Muito obrigada. Thank you once more, Professor Keyssar.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have you all a great